The first thing Denise Coleman noticed at her sister's funeral was that Serena Voss cried more than anyone else in the room. Not quietly, the way most people cry at funerals, the controlled, occasional grief of someone managing their emotions in a public space. Serena cried the way you cry when you have lost something central to your own life, when the absence that has opened up is so specific and so large that composure becomes impossible. She sat in the third pew with her hands pressed together in her lap and her shoulders shaking, and when the pastor spoke about Nadia Coleman-Webb's warmth and her laugh and the way she had always known exactly what her room needed, Serena pressed a tissue to her mouth and closed her eyes as if the words were too much to receive. Several people commented on it afterward. What a devoted friend. How deeply she must have loved her. It says everything about Nadia that she inspired that kind of grief in someone. Denise noticed it and said nothing because grief does not require a ranking system, and because she was too busy carrying her own to interrogate anyone else's. She had lost her older sister, her closest person, the woman who had been calling her every Sunday evening without fail since they were teenagers, and Denise had gone away to college, and Nadia had refused to let the distance become silence. She had lost the architect of the most beautiful house she had ever seen, the woman who drew buildings the way other people wrote poems, with a specific attention to how light would move through a space across the hours of a day, how a room would feel to the person waking up in it 30 years after it was built. She had lost her sister, and she was standing in a church surrounded by people telling her how sorry they were and trying to remember to breathe. So she noticed Serena's grief, and she filed it under devotion, and she moved on. She would spend the next 14 months understanding how completely she had misread what she had seen. Serena Voss had been a licensed grief counselor for 11 years. She had built a respected private practice in the city, published 2 articles in professional journals about ethical frameworks and bereavement support, and was known in the African-American professional community as someone who understood grief not just clinically, but humanly, who brought both her training and her genuine warmth to the people who sat across from her in the most difficult periods of their lives. She was good at her work, and she was good at it because she understood something most people don't understand about grief, that it makes people porous, that it opens up spaces in a person that are normally closed, that someone who understands how grief operates and is willing to move into those spaces with enough patience and enough warmth can become, in a relatively short period of time, indispensable to the person who is grieving. Serena understood this professionally, and she understood it personally, and she had understood it specifically about James Webb for considerably longer than anyone knew. Nadia Coleman-Webb died on a Thursday in April. She was 46 years old. She had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer 11 months earlier, and had spent those 11 months being exactly who she had always been, working when she could, resting when she had to, refusing to let the illness become the defining story of the final chapter of her life. She designed 2 buildings in those 11 months. She hosted Thanksgiving. She called Denise every Sunday evening without exception, and on the last Sunday before she died, she had talked for an hour and 20 minutes about a documentary she had watched about Japanese architecture and the specific quality of light in Kyoto in the early morning, and whether Denise thought she could get a sabbatical to go and see it. Denise had said absolutely, and they had made a plan, and 3 days later Nadia was gone. The house Nadia had designed for herself and James was on a tree-lined street in one of the city's established African-American neighborhoods. A 3-story craftsman with wide windows, an open kitchen that ran the length of the back of the house, and a study on the 2nd floor where Nadia had kept her drafting table positioned to catch the afternoon light. She had built the house the way she built everything, with complete attention to how it would feel to live in it, not just how it would look. Every room had a specific quality of light at a specific time of day. The kitchen in the morning, the study in the afternoon, the bedroom in the blue hour before dawn, when James was still asleep and Nadia was already awake and thinking about the day. James Webb was a secondary school history teacher who had loved his wife with the specific, uncomplicated devotion of a man who understood that he had married someone exceptional and had never once taken that for granted. He was 49 years old when she died, and he was, in the truest sense of the word, lost. He had known Nadia for 22 years and had been married to her for 17 of them. And the life he had built around her presence was so thoroughly organized by that presence that when it was removed, he did not know how to perform the most basic functions of an ordinary day. He forgot to eat. He forgot appointments. He sat in the kitchen in the morning in the specific light Nadia had designed for that room, and could not move from the chair because moving felt like leaving something behind. Serena Voss had known James Webb for 2 years before Nadia died. She had been introduced to him at a professional event, a fundraiser for a mental health initiative that Nadia had helped organize, and they had spoken briefly, pleasantly, the way you speak to your wife's professional acquaintances at an event you are both attending out of support for something she cares about. Serena was warm and interesting, and James had thought nothing of it. He was a man who had never once considered being unfaithful to his wife because the idea had simply never presented itself to him as a live option. He loved Nadia completely, and he thought Serena was a pleasant person at a fundraiser, and that was the beginning and end of his relationship with her for the following 6 months. What happened in the 6 months after that is something James would not understand until Denise Coleman put her sister's journal on the table between them 14 months after the funeral and asked him to read the last 3 entries. Nadia Coleman was 3 years older than Denise and had functioned, for as long as Denise could remember, as both sister and compass. She was the person Denise called when she didn't know what to do, not because Nadia always had the answer, but because talking to Nadia had a way of clarifying the question. She had a gift for listening that was different from the ordinary gift of paying attention. She listened in a way that made the person speaking feel that what they were saying was worth the time it took to say it, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people understand until they have experienced it and then lost it. They had grown up in Atlanta, the daughters of a high school principal and a pediatric nurse who had raised them in a house full of books and expectations and the specific warmth of parents who took their children seriously. Nadia had gone to architecture school in Washington, D.C., and Denise had gone to graduate school in New York for literature. And for 15 years, they had lived in different cities and maintained the kind of closeness that geography cannot touch if the people involved refuse to let it. The Sunday phone call started when Denise left for college and continued without interruption for 26 years, through graduate school and first jobs and Nadia's marriage to James and Denise's decision not to marry and the tenure process and the cancer diagnosis and everything that came between and after. 26 years of Sunday evenings. 26 years of an hour that belonged to nobody else. When Nadia met James Webb at a gallery opening in their late 20s, she had called Denise the following Sunday and said 3 sentences. He teaches history. He listens the way you want people to listen, and I think I'm going to marry him. Denise had laughed and said you've known him for 1 week, and Nadia had said I know, and she had been right. James was exactly what Nadia said. He was a man who listened the way you want people to listen, who was interested in the world without being exhausting about it, who loved his wife in a way that was visible without being performed. Denise had liked him immediately and completely, which was not something she gave easily, and the 3 of them had built the kind of friendship between a woman and her sister's husband that is its own specific thing. Not the sister's friendship, not the husband's friendship, but something that belongs to the 3 of them together. When Nadia was diagnosed, it was James who called Denise. Nadia had asked him to. She said she could not make that call herself without falling apart in a way she was not ready to do yet. And she needed Denise to already know before they spoke so that she could skip the first part and get directly to the conversation she actually wanted to have, which was about what they were going to do next and not about the thing that had just happened. That was Nadia, even at the worst moment, already thinking about the next move, already planning. Denise drove from her university to the city that same afternoon and sat with her sister for 6 hours. And they talked about the treatment plan and the prognosis and the buildings Nadia still wanted to design and the trip to Kyoto they had been talking about for years and had never taken. And at the end of the 6 hours, Nadia had held her sister's hand and said something that Denise would think about every day for the rest of her life. She said, "The only thing I'm genuinely afraid of is leaving things unfinished." Denise had told her that nothing was unfinished because it was what you say and because in the moment she believed it. She would understand later, reading the journal, that Nadia had been trying to tell her something more specific than she managed to say, and that the thing that was unfinished had nothing to do with buildings or trips or professional ambitions. Serena Voss entered the picture formally 3 months after Nadia's diagnosis, when she reached out to James directly, not through Nadia, through James, to offer her professional support. She had heard about the diagnosis through the professional network they shared, and she wanted him to know that she was available in whatever capacity was useful, as someone who understood what it meant to watch someone you love navigate a serious illness. It was a kind gesture. James mentioned it to Nadia, and Nadia said, "Of course, that's thoughtful of her," And that was the extent of it for another month. Then Serena began appearing at the hospital during treatment appointments, having heard from someone in the network that it was a difficult cycle. At the house with food that she left on the porch when nobody was home, accompanied by handwritten notes that were warm without being excessive. At the fundraising committee where Nadia still served despite everything, offering to take over the administrative tasks that had become difficult to manage. She was present and useful and completely appropriate, and Nadia trusted her, because Nadia trusted people until she had a specific reason not to, and because Serena's professional warmth was so well calibrated that it did not trigger the alarm that a less skilled person would have triggered. James appreciated her. He told Nadia, so more than once, in the way you tell your spouse that someone has been kind and you are grateful for kindness. He did not tell Nadia about the conversations that had begun to happen outside of the context of Nadia's illness. The coffee that started as a practical debrief about how James was managing and evolved into something that lasted 2 hours and covered his childhood and his career and a specific fear he carried about what his life would look like without his wife in it. He did not tell Nadia about those conversations because by the time they were happening, he understood, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that there was something in them that he could not name and that Nadia could not know about. And that understanding was its own kind of answer to a question he had not asked. Nadia noticed. She did not say anything to James because she could not fully articulate what she had noticed, and because she was dying and she did not want the last months of her marriage to be consumed by a suspicion she could not prove and might be wrong about, and because she had loved James for 22 years and she could not make herself believe the thing her instincts were telling her. She wrote it in her journal instead, the way she had written things in her journal her whole life, not to reach any conclusion, but to give the thing a shape outside of her own head. The last 3 entries were dated in the 3 weeks before she died. Denise would not read them for 14 months. When she did, she would understand that her sister had been trying to name something she was not able to name completely, and that it had been eating at her in the last weeks of her life alongside everything else, and that she had died carrying it unresolved, which was the thing she had told Denise she was most afraid of. She had been right to be afraid. Nadia died on a Thursday and was buried on a Saturday. And by the following Wednesday, Serena Voss had been to the house 3 times. Denise noticed this and told herself it was appropriate. Serena was a grief counselor. James was a man in acute grief. The visits were professional and kind, and Denise was not in a position to police who came to support her brother-in-law in the week after his wife's death, particularly when she was barely holding herself together and was driving back and forth between the city and her university, trying to manage her own grief, while keeping her teaching schedule from completely collapsing. The first month was a blur of logistics and casseroles, and people cycling through the house with a specific uncomfortable energy of people who want to help and don't know how. Denise took 2 weeks off and spent them in the city, sleeping in Nadia's study because she could not sleep in the guest room, and because being in the room where Nadia had worked felt, irrationally but undeniably, like being near her. She organized the paperwork. She handled the insurance. She coordinated with Nadia's firm about the 2 projects that were in progress and needed to be transferred to other architects. She did the things that needed doing because doing them kept her functional, and because James was not capable of doing them, and because she was Nadia's sister, and this was what sisters did. Serena helped. She was good at knowing what was needed and providing it without being asked, which is the specific skill of someone who has spent years professionally supporting people through crisis and understands that the most useful thing you can offer is not sympathy, but practical presence. She brought food that was actually edible. She sat with James when Denise needed to make calls without worrying about him. She handled the visitors with the professional grace of someone who understood that grief has a social management component and that the bereaved often do not have the capacity to manage it themselves. Denise was grateful. She told Serena so, genuinely, more than once. She thought Serena Voss was a good person doing a kind thing, and she was glad that James had someone in his corner in the hours when Denise could not be there. The first crack appeared 6 weeks after the funeral. Denise arrived at the house on a Saturday morning to help James sort through some of Nadia's professional files. There were drawings and correspondence that her firm needed, and Denise wanted to be there when James went through them, because she didn't think he should do it alone. She let herself in with her key and found Serena in the kitchen making breakfast. Not leaving food at the door. Making breakfast. Standing at Nadia's stove with a pan in her hand and coffee already made and the specific comfortable ease of someone who knew where everything was kept because she had been in this kitchen enough times to have learned it. James was at the kitchen table. He looked up when Denise came in, and something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but a specific awareness. The expression of a man who has been caught in a situation he has not yet admitted to himself is something that needs to be explained. Denise had stayed for an hour and left early. She had not said what she was thinking, partly because she could not fully articulate it, and partly because she was not sure she was right, and partly because she did not want to be having that conversation 8 weeks after her sister's death. She drove home and sat in her car in the parking lot of her university for 20 minutes and then went inside and taught her 2 o'clock seminar on the literature of grief, which was the kind of coincidence that the universe occasionally produces and which felt, that afternoon, like a particularly unsubtle joke. She began paying attention after that. The visits were almost daily now. Serena was at the house more often than she was not, and while the framing was still professional and supportive, the texture of her presence had changed in ways that Denise found difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. The ease with which she moved through the house, the way she referred to things, the good pan, the shelf where James kept his reading glasses, the specific brand of coffee James preferred, with the familiarity of someone for whom this information had been absorbed through repetition rather than offered as a practical detail. The way James looked at her, that was different from the way he had always looked at her, which was the thing Denise noticed most and hated most noticing because of what it implied about her brother-in-law and about her sister and about the timeline of everything. She said nothing. She just kept coming to the house, and she kept paying attention, and she kept telling herself that grief is disorienting, and that James was a man who was lost without his wife, and that it was possible to misread warmth as intimacy when you were yourself in grief and looking for something to be angry about that was more manageable than the thing you were actually angry about, which was that your sister was dead and you could not fix it. Then the Sunday phone call stopped. Not James's behavior toward her. James continued to be warm and grateful and present when she came to the house. But the internal Sunday call, the one that had existed in Denise's life for 26 years, the hour that belonged to nobody else, was now a silence that she had not yet learned to fill, and in that silence, she found herself reaching for the one thing that still felt like contact with her sister, which was the memory of their last conversations and the specific details of Nadia's life that she was afraid of forgetting. She asked James if she could spend some time in Nadia's study, going through things, preserving what needed preserving. He said, of course. He said, take as long as you need. He said Nadia would have wanted you to have whatever you want from that room. Denise spent 4 Saturdays in the study, going through Nadia's books and drawings and correspondence with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent 20 years teaching literature and understood that documents are the closest thing we have to the voice of someone who is no longer speaking. She cataloged everything. She labeled boxes. She was thorough and careful and completely professional about it, and she cried in the car on the way home every single time. On the 4th Saturday, she found the locked drawer. It was in the bottom of the drafting table, a shallow drawer she had assumed was empty because it was locked and she had no key. But on the 4th Saturday, she noticed that the lock had not fully engaged, that the drawer would open if she applied steady pressure to the right side of the front panel, and she applied that pressure, and the drawer opened, and inside was a journal she recognized immediately because she had given it to Nadia herself 3 Christmases ago. Dark green leather, Nadia's initials embossed on the cover. The kind of journal that implies something worth recording and keeping safe. Denise held it for a long time before she opened it. She understood that it was private. She understood that reading it was a line she could not uncross once she had crossed it. She understood that Nadia had locked this drawer for a reason, and that reason was almost certainly that the contents were not meant for anyone else's eyes. She opened it anyway, because her sister was dead and the drawer was unlocked, and because some part of her had known since that Saturday morning in the kitchen 8 weeks after the funeral that there was something she needed to understand, and this was where the understanding was going to come from. She read for 2 hours. The entries covered 3 years, the ordinary record of an extraordinary mind, the kind of journal that moves between the professional and the personal without ceremony, that contains drawings and quotes and half-formed ideas alongside the more intimate material that journals are usually kept for. Nadia wrote about her buildings and her clients and her arguments with the planning commission and the specific quality of light in the study at 4 in the afternoon. She wrote about Denise. She wrote about James with the warmth and specificity of a woman who had loved someone for 22 years and still found things to notice about him. She wrote about the cancer with a directness that made Denise stop breathing more than once. And in the last 3 entries, she wrote about Serena Voss. Not accusatorially. Nadia was too careful and too honest with herself for that. She wrote the way she wrote everything, which was precisely and without embellishment, which made what she wrote more devastating than any accusation could have been. She wrote about the things she had noticed. The coffee that James had mentioned and then stopped mentioning. The way Serena arrived at the house sometimes when James had said he would be alone. The phone call she had heard from the hallway that James had said was a colleague, and which had lasted 40 minutes and carried the specific quality of a conversation that was not about professional matters. She wrote, "I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know if I'm seeing something real or if the illness is making me paranoid about losing the things I love. I don't know how to ask James a question I'm not sure I want answered." And then, in the final entry, dated 9 days before she died, she wrote one sentence that Denise read 4 times before she put the journal down. She wrote, "I think she's been in love with him for longer than either of them knows." Denise sat in her sister's study for a long time after she put the journal down. The afternoon light moved across the drafting table the way Nadia had designed it to, filling the room slowly, specific and warm, and exactly as intended. Denise sat in the light her sister had built for this room and understood, with the methodical certainty of someone who has spent 20 years following the evidence of a text to its logical conclusion, exactly what she was looking at. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if this story is hitting close to home, subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. She took the journal home. She did not tell James she had found it. She began to document everything she had noticed over the previous 8 months, the way she documented research, chronologically, specifically without editorial commentary, just the facts arranged in the order in which they had occurred. The first visit to the house the week of the funeral. The breakfast she had walked in on. The progressive deepening of Serena's presence in a house that belonged to her dead sister. The way James's behavior had shifted in ways she had been trying not to name. The specific details Nadia had recorded in her journal, and the specific details Denise had witnessed herself, cross-referenced and organized into a picture that was no longer possible to look at as anything other than what it was. She spent 3 weeks doing this before she made a single phone call or had a single conversation with anyone. She needed to be certain. She needed to be the kind of certain that does not leave room for the possibility that she had misread the situation or been motivated by grief into seeing something that wasn't there. She needed to be the kind of certain that Nadia would have required of herself, which was the kind that comes from following the evidence wherever it leads rather than stopping when it becomes uncomfortable. She was that certain by the end of the 3rd week. Denise called James on a Sunday evening. Not a random Sunday. The specific Sunday that marked 14 months since Nadia's death, which was the anniversary she had been tracking without fully acknowledging that she was tracking it, because it was the anniversary of the last Sunday phone call, and she had been counting them every week since. 14 months of Sundays without her sister's voice. 58 Sunday evenings that had passed in silence where there had always been a call, and on the 58th one Denise Coleman picked up her phone and called her brother-in-law and asked if she could come over. James said of course. She arrived at 7 in the evening with the journal in her bag and the 3-week documentation folder in her bag and the specific controlled composure of a woman who has been a university professor for 15 years and has learned how to walk into difficult rooms and say difficult things without performing either the difficulty or the emotion. Serena's car was not in the driveway. Denise had timed it deliberately. James made tea. He was warm and glad to see her, the way he was always warm and glad to see her. And for a few minutes they sat in Nadia's kitchen, in a morning light Nadia had designed, in the chairs where the 3 of them had sat together hundreds of times. And Denise looked at the room and thought about her sister and let herself feel what she had been managing for 3 weeks, which was the specific grief of understanding that the person you lost was still being taken from you by someone who had not finished taking. Then she put the journal on the table. James looked at it. He recognized it immediately. Denise could see that in his face, the specific recognition of something he had wondered about and perhaps looked for and perhaps been relieved not to find. She said, "I found this in the locked drawer of her drafting table. I know it was private. I read it anyway because I needed to understand something and this was the only place I was going to find the understanding. I need you to read the last 3 entries." James did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it on the table between them for a long moment. The dark green leather, the initials, the journal of a woman he had loved for 22 years and who had been dead for 14 months. and Denise watched his face move through something she did not interrupt. Then he picked it up. He read slowly, the way people read things they are afraid of, going back over sentences that have landed somewhere difficult to confirm that they have understood correctly. When he finished the last entry, he put the journal down on the table and did not say anything for a long time. Denise waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent 20 years in seminars, training herself to let silence do the work that speech cannot do, to sit with the discomfort of an unanswered question long enough for the person who needs to answer it to find the words. James said, "I didn't know she knew." Denise said, "What didn't she know?" He looked at her. She said, "I need you to say it, James. I need to hear it in your words." What followed was a conversation that lasted 3 hours and covered the 2 years before Nadia's death and the 14 months after it. James spoke with the specific difficulty of a man who has been carrying something that has grown heavier with time and has not had anyone to set it down with. And Denise listened with the specific focused attention of someone who has loved both the person speaking and the person he is speaking about, and is trying to hold both of those loves simultaneously without letting either one collapse the other. The relationship with Serena had begun, James said, as something he had not named and therefore been able to tell himself did not exist. Coffee that was professional and then became something that stayed in a register he could not have defined. Conversations that he had convinced himself were appropriate because he had not yet done anything that he could identify as a concrete violation. And then Nadia had been diagnosed, and the conversations with Serena had become something he had needed in a way that he had known was wrong and had continued anyway, because grief and fear and the specific loneliness of watching someone you love die were making him into a version of himself he did not fully recognize and could not fully control. He had not slept with Serena while Nadia was alive, he said. He needed Denise to know that. Denise said, "I believe you." And then she said, "But you wanted to." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She said, "And after?" After 3 months after the funeral, when Serena was at the house daily and James was at his most lost, he had let something happen that he had been moving toward for longer than he could honestly account for. And after it happened, he had told himself that Nadia would not have wanted him to be alone, which was true, but was not the same thing as what he had done, and which did not account for the specific person he had done it with, which was the detail that changed everything. "When did she move in?" Denise asked. 6 months after the funeral, James said. He had asked her. He had not thought of it as asking her. He had framed it to himself as a practical arrangement, as having someone in the house who understood his grief and could help him navigate it, as the kind of decision that a man in his condition makes for understandable reasons. He had not thought about the house. He had not thought about whose kitchen it was, or whose study was on the second floor, or whose drafting table still had pencil marks on it from the last drawing Nadia had been working on the week she died. Denise said, "She's been sleeping in my sister's house for 8 months. James said, "Yes." She opened her documentation folder. She put it on the table beside the journal. She walked him through it. Not accusatorially, not with the specific controlled fury that she was feeling underneath the composure, but methodically, the way she would walk a graduate student through the evidence of a text, following the thread from the first professional event where James and Serena had met through the 2 years of escalating contact, to the diagnosis, to the months after the funeral, to the present, where Serena Voss was sleeping in the house Nadia Coleman-Webb had designed, and James Webb had still not changed the name on the mortgage documents, but had changed the beneficiary designation on his life insurance policy. That was the detail that Denise had found 3 weeks earlier when she had requested a copy of the policy as part of the estate administration process she had been managing since the funeral. The beneficiary on the policy was no longer Nadia, which was expected since Nadia was dead and the policy would have needed to be updated. The new beneficiary was not James's daughter from his first marriage, which would have been conventional. The new beneficiary was Serena Voss, which had been changed 8 months after the funeral, which was 2 months after Serena had moved into the house. James looked at the documentation folder and did not speak for a very long time. Denise let him sit with it. She understood that what she had just shown him was not only the evidence of Serena's intentions, but the evidence of his own complicity. Not malicious, not premeditated, but real and consequential and impossible to unknow now that it had been named. She understood that the man across the table from her was not a villain, but was also not entirely a victim, and that holding both of those things at once was the most difficult part of what she was doing, more difficult even than the evidence itself, because she had loved James Webb for 20 years, and she did not want to stop and could not pretend that what he had told her did not require something for both of them. She said, "I'm not here to end your life, James. I'm here because my sister deserved better than what happened in her house while she was dying, and because you deserve to know what you're actually in the middle of, and because Serena Voss has a professional license and a professional reputation that are built on the specific promise that she does not do exactly what she has done in this house." She put the journal back in her bag. She put the documentation folder back in her bag. She picked up her tea, which had gone cold while they were talking. She said, "I need you to ask her to leave." James said, "I know." Serena left the house on a Tuesday. Denise was not there when it happened. She had asked James to handle it, and he had. And he had called her afterward to tell her that Serena had argued at first, had framed the conversation as James having a grief episode, had used the professional language of her practice to suggest that what he was experiencing was a predictable phase of bereavement, and that he would regret acting on it, and that James had put Nadia's journal on the table and opened it to the last entry and pointed to the sentence about Serena and read it out loud, and that Serena had stopped arguing after that. She was gone by the end of the day. Denise spent 2 weeks doing nothing beyond teaching her classes and sleeping and calling her mother on Sunday evenings instead of waiting for a call that would not come, because she had started calling her mother on Sunday evenings 2 months after Nadia's death and had been doing it since. And while it was not the same, it was something, and something was what she had. She needed the 2 weeks to process what she now knew and to decide what she was going to do with it, because knowing something and deciding what to do with the knowing are 2 separate acts, and she was someone who understood that the second act carries consequences that require careful thought. The professional question was the one she kept returning to. Serena Voss had not simply betrayed a friendship or violated a personal boundary. She had used her professional role, the specific access and trust that a licensed grief counselor is given by virtue of her credentials and her position, as the mechanism for what she had done. She had identified a vulnerable person at the most acute moment of his grief, leveraged a professional relationship as cover for a personal one, and moved systematically into the life of the woman whose death she had been present for in a professional capacity. This was not just a personal betrayal. It was an ethical violation of the kind that licensing boards exist to address, and Denise Coleman had spent enough years in academic institutions to understand exactly how professional accountability mechanisms work and how to use them. She filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board for mental health professionals 6 weeks after Serena left the house. The complaint was detailed, documented, and specific. It included the timeline of Serena's professional contact with James beginning before Nadia's death, the evidence of the romantic relationship beginning within 3 months of the funeral, the documentation of her move into the house, and the beneficiary designation change on the life insurance policy. It included Nadia's journal entries, which Denise had submitted with a cover letter explaining the circumstances under which they had been found and the reason she believed they constituted relevant evidence of a pattern of behavior that predated the professional relationship. It included a statement from James, which he had provided willingly and with a specificity that made clear he understood what he was signing and why. The board opened a formal investigation within 30 days. Serena hired an attorney immediately and issued a statement through that attorney characterizing the complaint as a product of grief-related hostility from a bereaved family member who had misinterpreted a personal relationship that had developed organically between 2 adults following the death of a mutual friend. The statement was careful and professional and completely inadequate to the evidence Denise had submitted, and the investigator assigned to the case noted this in her first report. The investigation took 4 months. In the 3rd month, the investigator contacted 2 of Serena's former clients, contacts she had developed through a review of the professional network that Serena had used to initially approach James. And one of those clients, a man who had been widowed 3 years earlier and had worked with Serena in the year following his wife's death, agreed to speak with the investigator. What he described was not identical to what had happened with James, but was sufficiently similar in its structure. The escalating personal contact, the progressive deepening of presence, the specific way the professional relationship had been used to create an intimacy that went beyond the professional, that the investigator noted it in her report as a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Serena's attorney attempted to have this information excluded from the investigation as irrelevant and prejudicial. The board denied the motion. The investigation concluded in the 4th month with a finding that Serena Voss had violated the ethical standards governing professional relationships in grief counseling, specifically the prohibitions against dual relationships, against using the therapeutic relationship for personal benefit, and against conduct that exploits the vulnerability of a client's family members. The finding recommended revocation of her license pending a formal hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the interim, something happened that Denise had not planned for and had not sought, but did not prevent. One of the members of the African-American professional community, in which the Colemans were an established and respected family, happened to work in the building where Serena's private practice was located and happened to know someone on the licensing board's administrative staff and happened to mention, in the course of a conversation about professional news, that there was a formal investigation into a grief counselor in the city involving the Coleman family. The information moved through the community in the specific way that information moves through close communities, not through malice, but through the established channels of people who know each other and share information, because that is what communities do. And within 2 weeks of the investigation's conclusion, Serena Voss's professional reputation in the city had changed in ways that did not require the formal hearing to complete. Her referral network dried up. Colleagues who had been warm toward her became professionally distant. The 2 professional journal articles she had published were reviewed by their editors with a new attention to their content about ethical frameworks that produced a discomfort the editors communicated to each other through private channels. She was quietly removed from the planning committee of the mental health initiative that had been the occasion of her first meeting with James. The professional conference at which she had been scheduled to present a paper on ethical bereavement practice in the spring disinvited her 3 weeks before the event in a letter that cited scheduling conflicts and did not elaborate. Serena understood what was happening and could do nothing about it, because the thing that was happening was the community she had operated within for 11 years, applying its own judgment to what it had learned about her conduct, and that judgment is not subject to legal challenge or professional appeal. She requested that the licensing board hearing be postponed due to personal circumstances. The request was denied. The hearing lasted 2 days. Denise attended both days. She sat in the back of the hearing room and listened to the evidence presented and the responses offered and the board's questions and Serena's attorney's objections. And she did not testify because the board did not require her testimony and because she had said everything that needed to be said in the documentation she had submitted. She was there because Nadia deserved to have someone present who loved her, and because bearing witness to a consequence is its own form of accountability, and because she was a professor of literature who understood that stories require an audience to be complete. The board voted to revoke Serena Voss's license on the second day. James Webb left the house 6 months after Serena did. He did not sell it. He could not bring himself to sell it because selling it felt like the final act of a process that had already taken too much, and because the house was Nadia's, not legally now that she was gone, but in every other sense that mattered, and selling it felt like a decision that was not entirely his to make. He called Denise before he did anything and asked her what she thought, which was the right call and the one she had been hoping he would make, and Denise said what she genuinely believed, which was that the house should stay in the family. She bought it from him at market value. She had the money. 15 years of a professor's salary carefully saved by a woman who did not spend extravagantly and who had been putting money away since graduate school with the specific intention of one day owning something that was entirely hers. And she redirected that intention towards something that had been Nadia's entirely and that she wanted to keep in the family rather than let pass to strangers. She did not move in immediately. She rented it for a year to a young architect, a woman just starting her practice, recommended by Nadia's firm, who had admired Nadia's work and who treated the house with the specific reverence of someone who understands what it means to live in something that was designed rather than built, that was thought about rather than constructed, that carries in its walls and its light and its proportions the specific intelligence and sensibility of the person who made it. When a year was up, Denise moved in. She took the study on the second floor. She moved her books in over a weekend, filling the shelves that Nadia had built at the specific height she preferred, and she positioned her desk. Not a drafting table, just a desk, a professor's desk covered in papers and student work, where Nadia's drafting table had been, in the afternoon light that Nadia had designed for this room, and she sat in that light on the first evening and called her mother on Sunday and said she was home. The drafting table she kept. She moved it to the corner of the study, away from the window, and left it there with the last drawing still pinned to its surface. The building Nadia had been working on the week she died, a community center for a neighborhood on the east side of the city. The kind of project Nadia had always said mattered more than any of the prestigious commissions because it was going to be used by people who had not had enough things designed specifically for them. She left the drawing on the table, and she worked around it every day, and she looked at it sometimes in the afternoon when the light moved across it and thought about her sister and did not look away. The community center was built. Nadia's firm had completed the design after her death. Working from her drawings and her notes and the specific vision she had communicated to her team across the months of her illness with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. It opened 18 months after she died, on a Saturday in October, and Denise stood at the opening ceremony in the afternoon light of a building her sister had imagined and felt for the first time since April of the previous year, something that was not simply the absence of something else. She gave a speech. She had not planned to. The organizers had asked James, who declined, and someone had called Denise the week before, and she had said yes without fully thinking through what she was agreeing to. She stood at the podium of the community center her sister had designed and said that Nadia Coleman-Webb had understood something fundamental about architecture, which was that the purpose of a building is not to be looked at, but to be lived in, and that the best buildings do not announce themselves, but simply make the life that happens inside them better in ways that the people living that life come to take for granted, because the goodness is so thoroughly integrated into the structure that it stops feeling like design and starts feeling like the way things naturally are. She said that Nadia had built her own life on exactly this principle, that she had made the people around her better in ways they only fully understood after she was gone, that the community center was a building in her sister's image, and that the city was lucky to have it. She did not mention Serena Voss. She did not mention the journal or the hearing or the 14 months of documentation and legal process. She talked about Nadia because Nadia was the story that mattered, and she let the other story remain where it belonged, which was in the past, resolved, finished, no longer requiring her attention. James was at the opening. He had come alone and had stood near the back for most of the ceremony and had cried quietly during Denise's speech, which she had expected and had been glad of, because it meant that what had happened had not taken everything from him, that there was still enough of the man who had loved Nadia for 22 years left in him to be moved by her memory in a room full of people who had not known her, but were now standing inside something she had made. He and Denise had dinner after the ceremony. They had been doing this once a month since Serena left, a deliberate, agreed-upon practice of remaining in each other's lives despite everything, because Nadia had loved them both, and they had loved Nadia, and love does not always survive betrayal, but it sometimes does, particularly when the people involved are honest with each other about what happened and what it cost, and what they want from the relationship going forward. They had been honest. It had been difficult. They were both still there. Denise walked home from the restaurant through the neighborhood where Nadia's house was, her house now, and stopped on the pavement across the street and looked at it in the evening light. The wide windows were lit from inside. The garden Nadia had planted along the front was still growing, tended now by a woman from the neighborhood who had offered after Nadia's death, and who had kept offering until Denise had said yes. The house looked exactly as it had always looked, which was the way Nadia had designed it to look. Not impressive, just right, the specific rightness of something that has been thought about carefully and built with the people who would live in it in mind. She stood on the pavement for a while, and then she went inside and sat in the kitchen in the evening light and called her mother, because Sunday evening was Sunday evening regardless of what else was true. If this one stayed with you, smash that like button and subscribe. New stories dropping regularly.